thanks for joining, and very happy to welcome Ashley to the live stream, who's going to talk to us about the Responsible AI Institute and talk about things like explainability, interpretability, privacy, fairness, transparency. In my conversations with the experts in the industry, we found that there's a lot of interest in these topics from an aspirational perspective, but when it comes operationally, they need help. And that's the kind of help that Ashley and her team at the Responsible AI Institute do to help. So Ashley, without further ado, I'm going to pass the stage to you and I'm going to put your slides up. And thank you for joining us.
Thanks so much for having me here. It's always great to talk with you, Vic, and really excited to be part of this discussion today. So I, as Vic mentioned, am the Executive Director of the Responsible AI Institute, or you'll hear me refer to it as RAI. And I'm really just excited to share with you the work that we've been doing. And really, as we're thinking about all of these issues related to, or that are talked about a lot, related to bias or lack of fairness in AI systems, lack of explainability, but really building tangible tools for what does that actually mean? What do you do? For those of you that are interested in some of this work, you can find us at responsible.ai. So prior to being the Executive Director of the Responsible AI Institute, and for those of you that have been following our work for a little bit, we were actually very recently known as AI Global, and so we've just transitioned to this to be more in line with the various different tools that I'll talk about today, but the work that we do and really what we're advocating for. So that's why that change. So again, if you think that some of this sounds familiar, but you think it's from another organization, we're one and the same. So with that, I additionally, you'll see that we're doing this work with the World Economic Forum. And so I chair a working group related to that. And some of you hopefully are joining from the Government of Canada, where previously I was the Director of Data and Digital at Treasury Board Secretariat. And a lot of this work that you'll see that we're doing within RAI is really building upon a lot of the implementation gaps that I saw or experienced firsthand when really trying to implement the Directive on Automated Decision-Making Systems through the Government of Canada. And so that's a really important document for those of you that are in the government and haven't yet had a chance to go through it. Whether or not you think that it applies to your system or not, would definitely encourage you to have a look and just apply the concepts or the intent of what it is to how you're designing or building or implementing or even just any sort of experimentation with AI systems. It's very generic in nature because of the scope that we were thinking of. But we really wanted to, it's very still current in terms of, again, some of these discussions or thoughts that need to occur when thinking about the implementation of AI systems and doing so in a safe and trustworthy way. So even though Canada was really at the forefront of developing policies, especially as it relates to the government's use of AI systems, as you can see here, there's been an evolution over the past few years that was in 2018, we started that process to build out the policy work. And then really it was implemented in 2019 and came into effect in 2020. And so with that, again, it was early on, but really had a lot of the components that we're seeing in these now broader proposed regulations. The first one that's come out is from the European Union. And for those of you that haven't had a chance to look at it, again, just doing a skim of it will be worthwhile. But one of the things that's particularly of interest to us, and again, building off of lessons learned from the Canadian context, is this idea of requiring requiring oversight or a conformity assessment against AI systems, especially if they pose significant risk. And so again, for those of you that are familiar with the Directive on Automated Decision-Making Systems, this is a concept that we introduced there, that not all AI systems pose the same degree of risk, and so therefore should have a sliding scale of requirements attributed to that. But what's interesting about this idea of a conformity assessment is that I think there's still within this a recognition that the broad scope of AI systems really need to be thought of in a more nuanced way than something like the blunt policy instrument that we were looking to put in place. So things like, does a chatbot that is making recommendations or directing you to information like the taxes one that CRA put in place, does that hold the same degree of risk, and therefore does it need the same type of oversight as something that's looking at who gets visas to be able to work or study in Canada? So these are things that I think really need to be addressed and thought about. And so we're super excited to see that other countries and regions really do agree with this. And so, as I said, the EU's proposed AI Act is really putting this into the most concrete terms, but we do anticipate to see this. And as the same week that proposed AI Act was announced, the FTC, the Federal Trade Commission in the US, had a blog post, and they've very much adopted a plain language approach, which I know all of us can appreciate. But I liked how straightforward they were with this. Hold yourself accountable or be ready for the FTC to do it for you. So again, this idea of, again, what we started in the Canadian context of trying to put some guardrails or oversight over the use of these systems is really coming into fruition now, just a few years later. And we'll see that, again, some of these challenges that I'm speaking to with these policies being too broad, there's going to be a lot of significant work that's done to make them more nuanced and specific to both the type of the system, but then the context in which it's being used in as well. And we're really looking to help to inform that work. So I just have an example up here of one sector and how AI systems are being used. But really what we've done as an institute is we've tried to apply all of the various different policy instruments, principal documents, various different research as it relates to not only just what AI systems are being used, but really what the potential harms are associated with those systems. So as I said, on our website, we have various different tools, and one of those is a use case map. So if you go to responsible.ai and then under programs and tools, you'll see that we have, it's called a heat map, but it shows you, again, where there's different issues. And so we've been tracking that to just try and understand, why is there a need for these types of principles, or why is there a need for this type of oversight, and what exactly should be done? And so just again, using finance as one of the examples, we've been looking at, for example, automated collections and lending in collections, and trying to see trying to promote the value and the use of these, but also thinking about the potential unintended consequences or harms that it could occur when not dealt with appropriately or not implemented in an appropriate way. And what I mean by that is using some of these prediction style models with data that might not be fit for purpose. So for example, it could be a model that's been trained on data that is predicting how much lending is allotted to people in Saskatchewan, but it's used on data from BC, and there's quite a bit of different demographics there. And so you can see that there might be challenges then in the output of that system. And so these are maybe things that when there's less automation, a human would understand and catch and see those potentially regional differences, but might not be caught in the same way if it's a fully end-to-end automated decision-making system. So as I mentioned, the work that we're doing really is trying to get to this end circle of building out a certification tool. But we've realized in the best way to be able to build that and to do this work is to really work with a network of people or a broad community. And again, this is building off of how we approach this in the Canadian context, is recognizing that just because you might have the pen on the policy, you're not necessarily the expert for that. And in the case of AI systems, I'm going to keep saying, because it's so broad and because there's so many different types of technologies that are thought about with or that are encapsulated under this banner of AI, then it's really important that we are getting knowledge from the right experts, and getting their expertise and fitting it into a structure that really makes sense for the people that are designing, building, and implementing these systems. One of the things that we really tried to do and has stayed with me from a Treasury Board Secretariat perspective is to make sure that we were building a policy that ended up enabling good outcomes, not that was just there to demonstrate or have just different types of compliance requirements. And so why that's important and why I've said that stuck with me is that, and you might be wondering, how does policy at TBS relate to certification? Really what we're doing and what a certification is a private form of governance. And so with that in mind, again, with that same spirit of really trying to bring a community of experts together to actually build and validate this tool, ends up becoming a private governance instrument in this case, that is comprehensive, is complete, is relevant with the right amount of research, and is then therefore something that people will actually want to use because it's quite helpful to them. So that's really why that network is important for us, is to really learn from the community of experts. One of the things that we also then recognized is the need for education aspects. And so one of the things that we're doing right now is partnering with another organization with a similar mission to ours, Equal AI, and we're developing a badge program with them. This first version is focused on senior executives so that they have some frameworks and tools to be able to create appropriate governance within their organization, so that they can think through from a top-down perspective what needs to be done, and hopefully that matches with, then I know, a lot of the concern that comes from the people that are actually building and developing these systems, so that they kind of know how to integrate this into their broader decision making. Again, that's just one example, and that's where we're starting, but we're trying to be a platform to aggregate all of these different education opportunities as it relates to some of these challenges that I'm identifying. And I know this is quite quick to go through all of this. And so again, we're trying to provide a lot of those materials through our website. And then one of the things that, again, is really this very important and crucial building block for the certification is really thinking about the structure in which we see that certification being provided. And so what we've done is the open source version, or again, kind of precursor to it, to the certification concept, was what we have on our site, again, under programs and tools, called the Responsible AI Design Assistant. And as you can probably tell, even when I was building policy, really had practitioners in mind. So the people that are actually using this, what are the tools that they need? And so the Design Assistant is an open source free assessment that will allow people to go through it and really start to help them to think how to build, again, or design their systems in a way that is adhering to these various different principles and policies. And again, that can hopefully lead them then to, if there's a gap in their knowledge, here's some education requirements or some education programs, that might be able to help you. And then if not, there's a vast network of experts that can help kind of populate or help to inform you. And so one of the other tools that we have to complement all of this, for those of you that have known me previously, I led the development of Canada's Open Government Portal. So you can see a lot of similar themes through all of this. But in that context, found the aggregation of resources a really important concept that stuck with me. And so we've done an equivalent of that. So we have a responsible AI community portal that has these various different tools. And so the idea when you complete the assessment that we really want to build out, but it's not there yet, it is in a manual way, but we want to build a recommendation engine that will then, once you go through the assessment, recommend resources and materials, as well as people and then education tools that you can leverage to help build up that knowledge. And again, get you prepared for that certification. And as I was saying at the beginning of this is all to demonstrate compliance with regulations that are coming out quite quickly, or if you are in the Government of Canada and are building a system for internal purposes, then you already have one that you do need to comply to. So hopefully all of these tools can help you to do that in a more efficient way. And again, as I mentioned earlier, this is really, by having that implementation experience and knowing what the gaps are and having conversations with departments or people in departments that were building these systems, and they said, okay, well, what standard do we follow? What process makes us adhere to this policy? It was really difficult to say, well, we don't know yet. And so this is, as you can probably tell, helping to fill in a lot of those gaps. So in terms of what's included in this and even how we define responsible AI, we are looking at these categories. And that's why I was mentioning this map earlier, is that what we've done is we've really tried to aggregate content and knowledge, but put it into this measurable assessment, as I'm saying. And in doing so, we didn't want to create another set of responsible AI principles, since there are many, many, many of them out there. So I sit on OECD's network of experts for AI. And again, this is something that the Government of Canada is also involved with. And so we, like many others, see the OECD principles as the main principles for responsible AI to follow. And so we see this work being grounded in those. So by no way are these categories meant to be their own standalone principles. Again, we see them rooted in these best practices that have emerged, like the OECD's responsible AI principles. So in that vein, though, those principles are still very high level. And so it's important that we then break down not only how to define how does one adhere to those, but additionally, what types of then questions need to be asked really within each of those categories. And so that's why we've broken this down into assessment categories. But again, an easy way to think about this is our definition of what responsible AI is. So starting with robustness, we, and again, build off of community knowledge and expertise, are really looking at the performance and accuracy of the system, but then also things like data and model drift as it's relating to it. So especially where there's AI systems that do have learning components to them, how much are they changing? And are there concerns with that? And so we're looking for aspects related to that. From an accountability perspective, we are really trying to understand the oversight mechanisms through things like governance bodies or chief ethics officers, and the role that those play in trying to ensure that there's appropriate guardrails. Again, when there's learning components of the system, you want to make sure that you have more oversight, more human oversight, to make sure that the system's continuing to perform in the way that it was expected. And in the eventuality that it doesn't, that there are things like recourse mechanisms in place so that that people that have been potentially harmed are then therefore protected, or a decision, for example, can be reversed if that's possible. Some of the things that I'm sure most of you have heard the most about are issues related to bias and lack of fairness in these systems. And like the example that I was giving earlier with finance, we see this routinely, whether it's with health systems predicting who gets access to healthcare in the US context, who gets access to different types of levels of insurance, but even things like predicting diagnosis of different types of diseases. So we're working with a researcher that predicts, she's a dermatologist, and so predicting things like melanoma, based on the amount of training data provided. There's bias, as you can imagine, between precision with different types of skin color. And so these are things that we want to make sure that again, if there's the possibility to have control over how these systems are being built, because you're the one that's building them, that you are then using the appropriate amount of data or the right type of data, again, that's fit for purpose, or that you are at least checking those things and taking that into account, and where possible, using accurate proxies, for example, to make sure that you're mitigating as much bias and fairness, as much bias as possible to ensure the greatest degree of fairness possible. And as you can see, data quality is one of those very, very important pillars, as it's primarily one of the most significant inputs of any type of AI system. And that's both in the training of it, but also the ongoing operations of an AI system. And so really, this is conforming with existing data quality standards, but also data governance controls, as you can imagine as well. And so a lot of the questions in this assessment for that pillar were based on ISO 8000 and 2701 standards, but additionally, for those of you that are familiar with tools like data sheets for data sets, that really ask questions around the origin of and collection of data, it incorporates some of those where they make sense as well. And a lot of this, again, coming from the open data, open government space, were very similar things that were being asked for in terms of building out an appropriate metadata schema or a data dictionary to describe the data set, so that that people know how to use it. And while the audience for open data was any developer that's come across the data set, it's really important when there's a data collection from one organization, but it's being used by a different organization, that they have all of that information, like the lineage of the data, like the and just the background of that data set. So you can see how things that were often talked about as, oh, maybe that's a nice to have, we're giving this data away for free to developers in the open source community, how they become really, really important when we think about it in this context. And then last but not least, explainability and interpretability of the system. And many ask, what's the difference between explainability and is it really required? And so explainability is a full explanation of how the system runs and why it made a decision that it was making. And in many cases, there's a strong argument that we don't know that, and we might not need to know that. And so therefore, the idea of interpretability instead of explainability or full explainability is something that we also appreciate is is possible. And so we want to just understand or be able to interpret after the fact how a decision-making system was able to render that decision, or a prediction was made, for example. And one of the things that I would say across all of this, that's something that at least how we are approaching the assessment or the development of it, is to say, is it possible for the machine to do it as well or better than a human does? It's really, we're finding it not fair to hold machines to a higher degree of accountability than we already have been accepting in the design and deployment of various different tools. So even things like facial recognition systems, are they is the machine able to recognize it to the same extent? The caveat that I would say there is, again, goes back to if the governance aspect or the accountability aspect, that's exactly why you would want to have recourse mechanisms in place so that either the decision can be changed, or that in the case where the machine is wrong, which often there's a human error in these things, that some sort of, if not a change can be occurred, that then there's some sort of action to reverse or compensate for that error. So again, this is where these ideas of explainability and interpretability come into play. And as you can imagine, all of these things need to really be balanced from one another. And so that's why thinking about them comprehensively in one assessment versus building them out into separate assessments is something that we see really important. And that's why when we're talking about responsibility, that's a big piece of it, is thinking about this as a complete entire ecosystem. As you can imagine, when we're thinking about these categories, we do need to think about them. I keep saying AI system. And so what I mean by that is looking at the data, the models that it is being used for, but then also the context in which it is being deployed. So as I was mentioning earlier with the financial example, the same type of prediction algorithm for lending might be used in Saskatchewan versus BC. And so that context will matter. And again, potentially not even just for the training of it, that too, but also because there might be different types of changes or differences that adjustments that might need to be made to the algorithm or model based on the context. Things like cost of housing versus salary might be quite substantially different in Vancouver than it is in Saskatoon. So things like that are really quite important when thinking about this AI system in a comprehensive way. So similar to what I was saying with the assessment categories, this idea of responsibility is thinking about these complete systems in the context in which they're and then thinking about all of these different types of factors that should be addressed in a system. One thing that I would say, and I've somewhat alluded to this already, is that this might seem like a lot, and this is something we came across when implementing the directive as well. And it's, yes, there are lots of things to check. But for those of you that are familiar with existing IT governance, most of these things you're already being expected to do and to be thinking about. And so this is the application of those different types of concepts or existing rules from humans to machines. So part of that is a shift in accountability. But another piece of that is trying to figure out where you might have processes that you're already doing that just really need to be updated for the particular context. I will say, though, that obviously there's a significant difference as it relates to systems that do have learning capabilities, especially for some of that recourse mechanism piece that I'm talking about, but also oversight. The last thing that I'll say on this is that as you can imagine, and also maybe different from currently how IT systems are held to account through various different governance processes, is that this is really requiring there to be a multidisciplinary team that is reviewing these systems. As AI systems are socio-technologies, it's really important that, again, the database engineers and the product owners and the legal team are all in the room together at some point in the process and some point in the life cycle to make decisions and some of these different trade-off choices that ultimately do need to be made. So one of the things that we try to do with the directive, but also this work as well, and this is again stemming from a lot of cited best practices, is ensuring that there is a multidisciplinary team that's looking at reviewing these. And just by nature of the questions, it's not possible for one person within an organization to do that. And even though I'm talking about this as it relates to certification, all of these concepts do apply to the design assistant that's freely available on our site as well. So you can use that again. And the other thing is that you can see in terms of these areas of focus that we think about this in terms of also domain, region, and system type. And so I've been mentioning multiple different types of AI systems. Right now, the tool, and especially the design assistant that we have, is one size fits all, so it's applicable. But as I've talked about, there's downsides to that. And so I'll come to the areas that we're deciding to focus on right now in a second, but that's some of the considerations that we've had when choosing even just where we start with building a more nuanced assessment, is thinking about where are AI systems being used that are creating the most amount of challenges, in what regions, and so therefore what types of laws are either in existence or are being developed that might be applicable to this. And then also what are the domains that again have the potential to cause the most degree of harm. And so why we're or how we're building this out, as I said, is with this broader network and a broader community. But we're developing this in tandem with the World Economic Forum and the Schwartz-Reisman Institute for Technology and Society at the University of Toronto. And so it's really important that we as a small organization have this one singular mission to do this, but work with significant partners in this space that have been doing both research through the University of Toronto, but then also have access to a broad network like the World Economic Forum does, to give us stakeholders that have feedback and might implement this work as we move forward. And so again, we're really trying to build this out in that enabling fashion like I talked about earlier. So what's really important about how we're doing this in terms of the process itself is that because you might be familiar with various different types of audits or third-party audits that are popping up in this space, and we're super, super grateful because at least there's some oversight that is that's being put in place. But we want that to be consistent. And so we think that there really should be a similar process to accounting standards and processes that accountants go through, and similar types of consistency and objectivity as it relates to that. And so just last week, we had our first accreditation workshop with various different national accreditation bodies. And we've been working with Standards Council of Canada for quite some time to make sure that how we're building all of this work is in adherence with that. We talk about certification, and just for those of you that are real policy nerds, maybe not in this community, but just in case, and even as because I had it on the slide before, what the EU proposed AI Act speaks about is a conformity assessment. The certification is compliance or demonstration of compliance against a conformity assessment. So those two go hand in hand, just in case anybody was wondering that, which I am sure nobody was, but just in case. So on that, again, this idea of us building these systems, then accrediting them through a national accreditation body. This, we're not then, RAI is not the organization that's going to go and deliver the audit itself. It's an EY or Deloitte or KPMG, et cetera. Any auditor that is currently within organizations, this just gets added to the service that they then provide. And one of the things that I did as soon as I started working on this was really looked at how other certifications were developed in other domains, and why they were really needed and how they were successful. And one of my favorites is LEED for building development, sustainable building development. And most of you are probably familiar with the LEED symbol. And one of the things that you might not have noticed, though, is that they actually have 4 different levels. So there's a certification, main certification level, and then silver, gold, platinum. And the idea there is that we're really trying to set a minimum viable bar for what should be done and what should be thought about, and then really trying to get there to be a behavioral change towards doing a better job of addressing some of those concerns that I said. But we don't want to make it too difficult that people aren't doing this, or that they're being set up for failure when they're doing that. So that's just something to keep in mind and consider, is that when going through this, it's, again, I'm going to keep saying this, meant to be enabling and meant to be trying to get people and organize people within organizations to move in a direction of being responsible, but not assuming that it's easy to do and it's going to be perfect from the beginning. One of the important things that we thought from this is that we built out a system that is actually what the audit team would use, and that's similar to the design assistant, as I mentioned, which is a survey tool, and it's actually built off of the algorithmic impact assessment stack. So very much an open source community and tool. And one of the things that we're really trying to do with all of this is, as I was mentioning earlier, having our desire to have a recommendation system to say these are different types of resources and people that you should be talking to in order to implement this work appropriately, or that will help you with that. We want there to be an output from the certification that is also quite useful. And so it's demonstrating, as I was saying, even though you might be certified, or in this case, achieved silver status, that here are different things, and this is how you scored within each of those different categories, to then start to find even more remediation or mitigation measures that can be put in place. And so one of the things that, as I mentioned, with the education aspect that we're looking at is different types of micro badging. And so we see there being a strong dependency in a lot of the questions that we're asking on addressing some of these issues. And so we want to do this micro-credentialing or micro-badging to help to support some of the questions that are being asked. And again, this idea of having consistency and objectivity in the assessment of this work is quite important. And so, for example, one of the things that is asked is around diversity and inclusion training. We want to just make sure that there's consistency with how that diversity and inclusion training is being offered, or at least just to a certain degree, that's been addressed and thought about, and that it's not, and trying as much as possible to get away from just a box checking exercise, because this isn't just for regulation's sake. It's really because these systems we're seeing already are, they're really expediting a lot of the systemic biases and issues that we already have in society. And if we don't put appropriate guardrails around them, we're going to see, especially with protected classes, more and more harms that are presented. One of the, as I was mentioning earlier, we really want to focus on some key areas to get us started when making these more nuanced assessments. And so one of the factors that we took into account was exactly what I was just saying, is looking at where is the most amount of harm occurring from these systems, where these systems being used the most frequently, and then also where are there emerging or existing rules, as I was saying, that can be applied to, so that our assessment is grounded in something, so that it's not just like we came up with this and we think it's the right thing to do. So that's why we've decided to start with these 5 areas. I have realized, and I should have changed it on here because now I've changed it other places, but that fair lending is not, that's the objective that we want to achieve, but it's not the task. So just normalizing all of these. So it's the areas of focus are actually going to be automated lending and collections instead of fair lending, although that's the goal, as I said. Fraud detection, so automated fraud detection. We have a really interesting use case from Department of Labor in the US on automated human resources. So it's actually predicting where military vets can then have equivalencies for civilian jobs, so that it's not just because they might not always be super obvious. So if you are you were driving a tank in the Army, you don't have to go be a truck driver. You probably have a lot of other skills that could then be applicable, but also making sure that people are aware of those. So setting up a platform is something that they're working through. But again, based on some of what I've talked about before, wanting to make sure that those predictions are accurate and they're fair across all of the demographics that veterans fit into. But also looking at automated hiring as part of that, those use cases as well, because we've seen where there's been concerns related to that. And then health diagnosis and treatment. I spoke about that example a little bit earlier. And then health prediction services. Again, I've sort of addressed this, but we have seen a lot of concerns with just especially access to the same amount of care independent of your race, religion, gender. And this is something that is of increasing concern. And especially for certain demographics in specific regions. In Canada, we're super, super fortunate to have a fairly equitable system, but we're even still seeing how this is occurring in Canada as well. So again, that's why we've decided to focus on this. And what we've done is set up a working group for each of these. The first one is going to start with that automated lending and collections, and that will be the first week of June. Actually, that's next week. It might be the second week of June. Don't hold me to that. We do have both community members and then companies that are being asked to co-chair that, but the groups are open to everyone. So if you're interested in having your say of what should be included in all of this, then we would love for you to join us. So with that, I've been talking a lot, so I will leave it there for any sort of questions that you have.
Thank you, Ashley, for a great presentation. Very much enjoyed listening to you talk about just this notion of going from the concept to the concrete. I can understand now how organizations who have these aspirations to turn some of these visions into reality, how they can operationalize them in working with RAI. I always have a million questions whenever we talk, Ashley, but there's a number of exciting questions here. I want to put them up for you. Why don't you take them one by one? So I guess let's start with this question. So would you say that human-driven systems and AI-driven systems, that they should be held to the same account under a platform or a framework such as the one that you're developing?
Yeah, I think that this isn't going to be for all use cases necessarily, but I think in general, as I was saying, with something like facial recognition systems, we think that, there should be 99.9% accuracy or the system shouldn't be allowed. I think that there should be a recognition that humans get these things wrong as well. Again, it's not so much about, it's not just the accuracy though that needs to be looked at, it's everything else that's around that. So typically, let's say like what we saw in the US context with a man being arrested for stealing something at a Sinaloa store, and he wasn't even there at the right place and right time to do that, then it's really just poor investigation that existed. And so the issue wasn't the facial recognition system. That was a problem. But we shouldn't therefore just ban facial recognition systems, in my opinion. It's then all of the context in how they're being used and the oversight that's associated or attributed to that as well. So the detectives should have done their job. So that's I think that that's what I was driving at with having some consistency between human and machines.
Okay, that's great. There's another question here, Ashley. On your last slide, you touched on the notion of health prediction services. So here's a specific question. Is there any additional information on your website or any white papers your team has authored to dive a bit deeper into this specific focus area?
We haven't posted any white papers yet. There's information in the portal. I don't know all of the resources there, so there should be some research in there. If not, then I can ask the team to definitely add what we've been using as guiding our interest in this. Yeah, so check out the community portal for that.
Okay, thank you, Ashley. Here's another question. So you talked about this notion of sort of regulation and audits and evaluations. How realistic is it to hope for a public body that has the insight and the oversight, so the knowledge and the teeth, to confirm that everyone is developing AI responsibly?
I think limited, which is why I am doing this work. So this is, as I said, I was doing research really into how public governance and private governance can work to support one another. And so I think it's very, very important that public bodies do set out the broad rules for what and expectations for what's required. However, I think that this idea of having that knowledge and even the capacity and resources to do an appropriate assessment against it at the degree of nuance that I know is required is going to take quite a few years to transition these public bodies into having those types of skills. So this is where, again, we've seen in the past where private governance mechanisms like certifications or conformity assessments like we see for financial services have gone and augmented then those public rules. And so that's really why we're doing this work. Yeah.
Okay, thank you, Ashley. Here's another question I think would be very interesting. So, let's say that you have an organization that gets an audit done and they find that there's area for improvement, there's room for growth. Are you then going to help them also with the tooling, or would you point to some software tools? How would they do things like explainability, fairness, etc.?
Yeah. No, I can't. We don't have the resources for that. We're not meant to be a services organization. In order to understand the problems ourselves, right now we are working with some of our member organizations to do that remediation. So we're still very much in that phase of building this out with our members. But what we're trying to do as we work through this is establish a almost like qualified vendor list and be able to point people to service providers that we think are a good fit for the work that they would need help with. And there's many organizations that are already starting to offer automated auditing services. And we want to make sure that what definitions they're using are applicable to those systems. And then again, they're being done consistently. And so that's part of the standards work that we're trying to establish with this. But I mention these because they're like Data Robot, Arthur AI, Cognitive Scales, Cortex Certifies, tools like that, Darwin AI. And they actually sit in the system. And so there's an ongoing monitoring, and I spoke to that quite a bit in my presentation for that reason, is that these systems can change so much. And so I really like this idea of these systems that are then sitting server side on your own server, that are then monitoring if there's any sort of variances and flagging or providing alerts when there's issues. So that's something that we hope. I'm doing a mapping of, they're popping up every day. So just a mapping of who's doing what, how it applies, and then we can make those recommendations.
Okay, thank you. That's great. Here's another question, Ashley. So, this notion of deep fakes, or more generally, AI-driven technology that can be used to do disinformation or misinformation, as this is becoming more and more mainstream, how does your framework address the notion of AI for social good? I mean, really from an intentional perspective, is there some aspect to audits and evaluations as a part of your framework?
Completely. So that's why I was mentioning these high-risk systems, and deepfakes certainly fit into that. So one of the things that we've done is how our assessment works is that there's risk questions and mitigation questions. That's not going to be clear to you when you see it. You don't know that it's a question that's for that unless you're kind of familiar with how this all works. But that's definitely the idea. And so in that context, and specifically for this question, we do have a question that is asking around if there's an if there's the ability to alter someone's voice or presence. And some of these questions are just what I've said is like, do not pass go. Like that's ultimately, then it gets put into a high risk category, and then there's quite a bit of oversight over it. And so similarly to how we did this with the directive on automated decision-making systems, once it was in a high-risk category, then it was at the highest degree of approval. So it needed to be approved by Treasury Board Secretariat. And then again, these are things that are just trying to be, maybe it's too heavy-handed at this point, but until we know more, you want to have the most amount of rigor or oversight over those.
Okay, thank you, Ashley. And I have one last question, by the way. Great answers to all these excellent questions. So one last question for you, Ashley, and I want to pull back a little bit here. So you talked about how such a framework can enable organizations to abide by the law, to comply with statutes, and certainly that's a good thing to do. You want to avoid penalties and you want to have social license by not doing bad things. But is there also a market for virtue? And if you look, for example, even in the financial markets right now, there is a growing segment of ESG investing where there's not just a question of maximizing sort of the shareholder value based on the stock price, but also there's all these other ESG factors. So do you see your framework helping organizations to actually improve their competitive positions, but also to grow their market valuation?
It's such a great question, Vic. And I think that even to the last question, I talked about deepfakes, but the question was really around what governments should do. And so I think in addition to putting in regulations, one of the things that we're seeing, not even just for investors like you're talking about, but also around how organizations are procuring these different types of systems, there's rules and safeguards that could be put in place there. So I think there's a variety of things that governments can do, regulations, but in procurement, also in terms of investor protection, for example. And then that'll, similar to what we're seeing in the environmental sector with ESG, there'd be additional protocols for that. But one of the things that my colleague at the World Economic Forum, Mark Kane, speaks about a lot is this idea of demand signals. And so I think in a very similar way that you're talking about with like this idea of a virtue market, I like that phrase, that whether it be because people don't want to end up on the front page of the newspaper, or whether it be because they don't want to make a bad investment, these various different demand signals that aren't just about compliance of a regulation are really emerging. And so, as I said, I mentioned a couple of them with investment and making sure that even and beyond like I've made a bad investment concept, we are seeing this need for a more virtuous investor to just like not want to be involved or entangled in something that's going to be putting the wrong person in jail or keeping someone in jail or denying people access to healthcare or services. There's a lot of people that now that investors are being more public about their efforts, they don't want to be associated with some of these different types of technologies, but also just really highlighting that procurement piece of it. I think that that's where we need to start with all of this, because I think that, again, whether it's in through the vein or lens of being virtuous or whether it's just protection, there's a strong question that comes out around liability. So is it the liability of the consumer of that product? So whether that be in the case of the government's acquiring some type of system, or on the service provider that developed that. And as we saw with the case of Phoenix, for example, while not an AI system, the liability was really on the government for not doing the appropriate training in that circumstance, or one of the reasons. And so we've seen this again with non-AI technologies, but you can only imagine the impact that those same issues could have or could arise when appropriate protocols, like through whether the procurement process be or the implementation process be, for these types of systems, especially when there's those learning components to them.
Thank you, Ashley. This was a great conversation, very insightful, very foresightful, and just kudos on the great work you and the team are doing
Thanks.
in the Responsible AI Institute. And it's great how you talked about really elevating your reach and your span by partnering up with the Schwartz-Reisman Institute, University of Toronto, World Economic Forum. So we'd love to have you back in a couple of months and give us an updated lay of the landscape and really on many of the successes and accomplishments. So thank you so much, Ashley, and we'll see you again soon.
I would love to. Thanks so much. Thanks for having me back.
Thank you. Bye for now.
Bye.